Hello, and my previous stream, which was related to looking at Israel from the Genesis 6 perspective, cut out unexpectedly, and I apologize. I'm very new at this whole streaming YouTube stuff. I'm a writer, so I typically am writing articles, so I apologize. But I want to pick up where we left off. When the stream cut, I was mentioning that if we look at the Genesis 6 worldview after the Tower of Babel, God disinherits all of the nations and turns them over to the sons of God, the B'nai Elohim, divine beings that have real authority over the nations. And there's 70 nations, and of course, at the time that he disinherits the nations, there is no Israel. He has not formed Israel yet. So in the Genesis 6 worldview, Israel is the only nation that is under the direct authority of God, Yahweh, from a national God standpoint. And I just want to explain in Scripture, you can see where these sons of God have this authority, but it's tied to nations, and it's tied to borders. So, for example, in the book of Daniel, the archangel Gabriel is actually, prevented from getting to Daniel. It slows him down because he had to contend with the prince of Persia, who is, clearly a B'nai Elohim, a son of God that is over Persia. And in fact, in the book of Daniel, this son of God in Persia is so powerful that God has to send the archangel Michael to contend with him so Gabriel can continue on and go and meet with Daniel. So if you're looking at Scripture through a Genesis 6 worldview, you have Israel as the only nation which God exercises direct national control over. And the response I usually get from my fellow Christians when I say that is, well, they don't behave like they're, under the direct purview of God. What they're doing in Gaza indicates that they're not following God's commandments, to which, as a Christian, I say, yeah, I see that. As Christians, we're commanded to love our neighbor, pray for our enemies. We're definitely not commanded to, turn their homes and their cities to dust. And I'm going to be perfectly honest with everybody. As a Christian, I have a very difficult time watching what Israel is doing in Gaza. It's tough. It's difficult. And, at first glance, it seems like something that is just patently unacceptable. But I would encourage Christians to think a little bit deeper on this subject. For example, I want to take you back to the book of Joshua and the Exodus. And if you recall, as soon as the Israelites enter the promised land, what's one of the first things they encounter? A giant or a group of giants. They return back, they send some spies into the land, and when they return, they say, wow, there's giants here. This is a direct connection to Genesis 6, the descent of the Watchers and the birth of the Nephilim. These are remnants. These are stragglers of that initial rebellion. And God proceeds to use the Israelites as a tool to cleanse the land of these Genesis 6 carryovers. And, of course, I don't think these giants that we encounter in Exodus are the bona fide watcher to human Nephilim, which in the book of Enoch and the book of Giants are described as, incredibly powerful beings. They're half divine, half human. These are just seemingly large, very large people, very physically powerful people. And the Israelites are frightened of them, as anyone would expect. And if you follow that thread, the final cleanup of this Nephilim contagion, should we call it, that arrived at the descent of the Watchers in Genesis 6 is when David defeats Goliath, whom we're told is another giant. So in the Exodus and in the book of Joshua, you have these incredibly brutal stories that many Christians and non-Christians struggle with. Stories of the Israelites being commanded to place entire populations under the ban. And the ban is everyone has to be killed, including the animals. And if you remember, King Saul loses favor with God because he fails to kill a specific king. I can't off the top of my head remember the name, but the prophet Samuel becomes very upset. You didn't obey God. And as we move through that story, there's an intensity to it. But we know from Scripture that these particular stories are God's direct leadership and intervention over the nation of Israel. If you remember in the book of Joshua, the Israelites failed to eradicate all of these populations that God asks them to eradicate. And they're essentially told by God that this will torment you. This will be a problem for your people now and forever because you failed to do what I asked you to do. And we're now thousands of years down the road, and there is still violence between Palestinians, Persian, Arabs, Muslims, Islamic, whatever label you want to place over them, and Israel. And I'm not going to say that I believe that, the modern day Palestinians are somehow tied to the Nephilim or tied to this ancient rebellion. I don't think that. I think the modern day Palestinians are people just like everybody else. And as I said earlier, I do struggle with the level of brutality that's being unleashed by Israel on the Palestinians. But as I would call Christians' attention back to these stories and the scriptural evidence that this type of situation would continue, all tied back to this failure to eradicate it from the start. And of course, what God's concern was is that they would pull the Israelites into idolatry and corrupt the culture. And, God was creating Israel to be a holy nation. So holy, in fact, so aligned with him that the Israeli people could stand in his presence without being consumed. Scripture tells us that sin, our misalignment from God, means we'll be consumed in his presence. And, when you see what's going on in Gaza today, and it is extremely difficult to watch, you have to think back to the story of the fall of Jericho. You have this heavily populated and heavily fortified city. The Israelites are commanded to march around it with the Ark of the Covenant. And on the final march, they blow their shofar horns, at which time the walls collapse and the Israelis invade in, and they have to kill everybody. Man, women, children, and animals. That's brutal, and that's intense. But that was part of the cleanup of this corruption tied to Genesis 6. So there is a biblical precedent for this conflict. There is scriptural evidence that the conflict would continue even into our modern times. And there's scriptural evidence that Israel is fighting on behalf of something that we can't understand, and it is outside of our purview to comment on. I know that's difficult for Christians to process that, especially with the revelation of Jesus Christ. And we're going to get into that here shortly. I don't want to insinuate that I'm saying that Israel is on a divine mission from God to cleanse the land of Palestinians. I don't believe that. I believe there's a lot of strings attached to that conflict. And as a Christian, I feel that violence is unnecessary in any situation. But I think American Christians need to understand that modern Judaism is not Christianity without Christ. When the Second Temple fell, Judaism in its original form fell right there alongside it. So if you brought Peter and Paul into a modern synagogue, they wouldn't know what was going on, because modern Judaism is entirely different than first or second temple Judaism or first century Judaism was. What Judaism morphed into is modern day rabbinic Judaism, which is more focused on readings, prayers, and rabbinic interpretation of the scriptures. And the Talmud, a very controversial book among Christians, but a very heavily read book amongst the Jewish people. And I know the Talmud says terrible things about Christ. I don't like that. I find it offensive to an extent. But I also understand that those things were written at a time when there was a lot of tension between Judaism and Christianity. We try in the United States today to pretend that Judaism and Christianity have had this beautiful, harmonious relationship and Judeo-Christian values. That's not the case. Christianity and Judaism have had some terribly rough patches. Christians have done awful things to the Jews, and there are times that the Jews haven't been super nice to Christians either. So to pretend that there's this glorious harmony between Christians and Jews is, quite frankly, absurd. History says otherwise. And right up until how American Christians behaved towards the Jews at the dawn of the Holocaust, an entire ship full of Jewish refugees came to the United States, and most of them, we let a few of them in, but the vast majority were turned away. It was awful, as a matter of fact, what we did. And during at the start of the Crusades, there was a break-off movement called the People's Crusade, and it was led by a specific priest, and I can't off the top of my head remember his name. Well, they were marching toward, it turned out to be a disaster. They got decimated once they got to the Middle East. But on the way to the Middle East, they stopped by Germany and slaughtered a bunch of Jewish people. So this notion that Christians and Jews have just always been dear friends and shared the same values is, quite frankly, absurd. So modern day rabbinic Judaism has become infused with Zionism, and infused with something called Kabbalah. Now, I'm not going to go too deep into this, but I am going to comment on Kabbalah because I see people online talking about Kabbalah as witchcraft and Kabbalah as black magic. It's not. I haven't studied. I've never practiced Kabbalah, but I've read up on it quite a bit. And Kabbalah, I can't remember exactly what year it was developed, but it was developed by a very prominent rabbi. He wrote the primary book of Kabbalah. It's called the Zohar. And Kabbalah proposes, it's an interpretation of the scripture. So this rabbi looked at scripture and was trying to get a layer deeper and look at the nuts and bolts of what's actually happening and what these stories are actually telling us. And his theory and what became Kabbalah is this idea that God's nature is giving. And to be able to fully express that nature, God had to create a being to which he could pour into, he could give to, and he created Adam. And I get the impression when I study Kabbalah that Adam, I assume he was a human being on some level, but I don't know that he was a human being as we are human today. But God was pouring his divine essence into Adam. Adam, being a being meant to receive, was also driven by ego. And at some point, as God's pouring this divine essence in, Adam rejected it and caused a shattering of God's divine power. And it caused these sparks of divinity to spread out across the earth, and they formed people. And it's my understanding that the Jews believe they were formed from the divine, godly aspect of this, and Gentiles, or as in many of the texts, goyim, were formed by this more shadowy, fallen uh, series of sparks, so to speak. This equates to why in traditional Jewish writings it's not real welcome for Jewish people to date or to marry non-Jews. The idea is that some of this can spread and be passed on to a Jewish person. A goy could spread their negative essence onto a Jewish person. This is highly offensive to many people. Many Americans, many Christians get offended by this whole notion. I don't find it offensive at all, and I'll explain why. So in Kabbalah, the goal is to like mine and release these divine sparks so that they can be reunified with God. And the notion is that God's forgiveness is of such power that when he grants forgiveness for despicable sin, that releases this divine energy back to him. And so Kabbalah, you'll do something that's sinful and then do something that's good and seek redemption. And when you're to the point where you're seeking that redemption, you liberate this divine energy. And it's based around balance, it's based around mysticism, and at its upper echelons, there is some that you can impact reality through this practice. And I'm not going to say that every rabbinic Jew is a Kabbalist. They're not. But some of these ideas, these mystic ideas, have seeped into mainstream Judaism. But I think that any Christian that would take the time to study this, it's fascinating. And I know when I look at the life of Christ, which was this great outpouring of redemption and great outpouring of mercy for people who are so deeply sinful in our nature, sometimes as Christians we forget. Each time we commit a sin, we're sinning against an all-good, all-knowing Creator God that is eternal. They're deep cuts. And that same God expresses joy when we seek redemption. So I see a little bit of harmony between these ideologies, this rabbinic Judaism and Christianity. And what I mean by that is we're talking about God here, folks. He can walk and chew bubblegum at the same time. God's promises and covenants are irrevocable. I believe that God can have a relationship with the nation of Israel as their national God through this divine council system, and have a relationship with Christians through Christ, who, of course, as Christians, we believe is the second person of the Trinity, one God, three persons. And I'm a Trinitarian Catholic. I believe in the Trinity. I know it's a complex topic, and I'm sure I'll talk about it in depth at some point. But I believe God can have his relationship with Israel under the original covenant with Abraham, and that's going to look a lot different than his relationship with Christians through the second person of the Trinity. Now, it is vitally important that Christians remember modern Jews don't believe that Jesus was the Messiah. In fact, they believe he was born out of wedlock, that a Roman soldier was his father, and that he was a rebellious guy that was crucified by Rome. This is deeply offensive to Christians, but you have to understand the cultural and historical context of these ideas, and you have to understand that how Jewish people view their relationship with God and how they view God himself. They view God, as Christians, we view God as a fatherly figure that we can have a personal relationship to. The Jews often view God more as a conscious source of energy, and that as the chosen people, they can harness and use this energy. And when they use it congruent with God's purposes, they're blessed. When they use it out of step with God's purposes, they're cursed. And there's even Jews that believe that the Holocaust was a judgment from God for failure to align and follow his will. I think that that's important for Christians to understand, that we're both having a relationship with God, but that relationship looks very different for each of us, and that's okay. I don't think that's a reason for us to hate one another. I don't think that's a reason for us to talk poorly about one another. I think we can both have our relationship with God, an all-knowing, all-powerful, eternal being, and I think that's all fine. And I know it is very difficult for Christians to see what's going on in Gaza and Lebanon and the Middle East. And it's confusing from a Christian standpoint. It's not confusing from a Genesis 6 standpoint, and it's not confusing from a scriptural standpoint of the history of Israel. I'm not saying what the Jews are doing in Gaza is 100% correct. I am saying that I think before we judge them, before we ridicule them, and before we look down upon them or hold ourselves morally superior, we should remember just how complex the biblical narrative is, how complex the nature of God is. And also remember, this is a deeply fallen world. God gave us the Edenic mandate, Jew and Goyim alike. And the Edenic mandate was to extend Eden outward, to be stewards of the earth, to care for the earth, to care for animals. It's implied in Scripture that we had a very unique connection to the earth before the fall. We treat this planet like it's a strip mine. We treat animals like they're ours to abuse and to slaughter and to use as a resource. It's appalling how we treat this planet, and everybody knows it. Trying to justify it is the same as trying to justify what's going on in Gaza. It's unjustifiable. And my point by saying that is, I imagine the good, clean, hokey-dory, this is great way of handling conflict died the minute human beings decided to join the other sons of God in rebellion. And the story of the Islamic faith, if we look through the same Genesis 6 worldview, it's alarming. And Christians need to remember St. Paul makes it clear that, one, there is a temporary hardening of the heart of the Jewish people. Scripture tells us that. The New Testament tells us that. Until the fullness of the Gentiles comes into the church. That the heart of Jewish people will be hardened to Christ. When the fullness of the Gentiles comes in, we're told in Scripture that there will be a moment that the Jews realize Christ is their Messiah, and they'll come to Christ, and they achieve their salvation. So I think everybody needs to keep that in the back of their mind as these events unfold in front of us. And, St. Paul warned us that fallen forces, fallen divine beings, will appeal as beings of light. And what measure did he give us to interrogate these beings? If they preach a gospel different than the Old Testament and different than the New Testament, you can assume they're fallen divine beings. Well, Islam is a complete rewriting of the Old Testament and the New Testament. The Muslims they revere Jesus as a prophet, but they don't believe he was crucified. All of the Old Testament stories are all mixed up. And most Muslims argue that the Bible was altered and isn't correct and so forth. That's an important data point when looking at the conflict in Israel through a lens of Scripture. And to kind of wind this down, I could go on for days and days about this topic because it truly does fascinate me. And I think that anybody, if you take the time to really, really understand Scripture and Torah. And I know the Old Testament and Torah are technically the same thing, but you got to study Torah with rabbis. I did that 2 years ago. And while the rabbis that I worked with, their view of things was vastly different than mine as a Christian, they were very respectful and very kind. And I felt gave me a full experience of understanding Torah from the perspective of a modern Jew. And it's not how we see the Old Testament. And I would encourage Christians, if you're able to do that, go for it, because it's a really unique experience, and it will enlighten you as to how our Jewish brothers and sisters, see these things. And I think you won't get quite as hung up on the differences, because there's a congruent nature to this. And like I say, I believe God can walk and chew bubblegum at the same time. The second person of the Trinity, Christ, can be with us and can be the force that seeks for mercy and justice and compassion and care of the weak and all of those things, while God's relationship with the Jews can be something entirely different that we don't fully understand. And it's a fascinating topic, and there's a lot of talk going on. I know Professor Jiang just did a big tour in the United States and was talking about various Jewish groups and infiltration in governments. And I don't know if it's true or not. I have no way to know if it's true. I know he gets heavily criticized for these theories. But I would tell folks that even if it's true, I do believe the Jews, whether in their opinion or their view or in reality, do believe they're working with God. And, I would really encourage Christians to read Second Temple Jewish literature. It vastly improved my understanding of Scripture. It vastly improved my understanding of who Jesus of Nazareth really was. It is congruent with that's what the Genesis 6 worldview is. We call it the Genesis 6 worldview. Dr. Michael Heiser has spent a career essentially uncovering it. But it's a Second Temple Jewish worldview. It's the worldview of Peter and Paul, the disciples, and Jesus himself. It's their theology. It's how they saw the world. And it will dramatically improve your understanding of Scripture. And it will dramatically reduce the need for this tension between Jews and Christians. That tension doesn't need to exist. I don't think it should exist. I think we're both on two separate missions from the same divine source. And I know it's really difficult for Americans because we feel this war in Iran is being waged for Israel. I think it is, obviously. But I think it's also very natural for Jews and Christians to stand together. If we are entering these, technically we've been in the end times since the life, death, and resurrection of Christ. All of Christ's predictions came true, other than the ones that remain to come true in the future. I think it makes sense for Jews and Christians to enter this together and to stand together, and to set our differences aside and to work together, because I do believe we're both serving the same God in many cases. I think it looks very different for Jews and Christians and how we do that. But I think it is natural for us to work together in this regard. So as a Christian, it does not bother me as much, I think, as others. I don't like the situation in Gaza. I don't like the war in Iran. I think it's going to be a disaster for the United States. It already is. The thought of children being killed bothers me deeply. I struggle to see children as an enemy combatant. But October 7th bothers me too. The fact that people thought that they could come in and rape and kill Jewish people with impunity, that bothers me too. So it's a complex and difficult topic, but it doesn't have to be one that leads to hate. I caution my Christian brothers and sisters, when hate starts, you're empowering the fallen powers. And these in the West, we've flattened Scripture, and most American Christians believe there's angels, there's demons, there's God, and there's humans. That's not what the Bible teaches. There is a very complex and diverse cosmos, and the Bible doesn't tell us who these fallen powers are. We don't get a biography or a description of them. But the cultural mythology does. And Second Temple Jewish scholars treated Greek mythology, Mesopotamian mythology, all the mythologies as windows into the same story. And when you understand Scripture in this Second Temple way, it is a master key to all of the old ancient text that unlocks the whole story. And the whole story is that the Most High God, the God of Israel in the Old Testament and the New Testament, sits as the sovereign, the head of the divine council, the creator of our reality. And, Christians can be upset with Israel all they want, but it doesn't change the fact that the Jews are in a covenant with God and that they have a covenant relationship with God. And, I keep hearing about this Greater Israel Project, and they're trying to do the Greater Israel Project and yada, yada, yada. They may be very well trying to do the Greater Israel Project, but Abraham was promised to his descendants pretty well that whole Greater Israel Project. And as I said before, God's promises are irrevocable. My view is they're going to have it sooner or later. And I know much of that land is occupied by other nations, but in my view, they're going to have it sooner or later. The Bible does not suggest that the behavior and actions of the Jews are going to make the nations happy, or it's going to make perfect sense and people are going to celebrate it. It suggests quite the opposite. Israel will be a heavy stone, the book of Revelation tells us. That sounds a lot like Israel will be a difficult ally. So I guess in closing, I would say that I think it's okay to take issue with what's going on in Gaza. I think it's okay to stand up and say, hey, the secular state of Israel, this country on the map, I don't like what they're doing, and I wish we could find a better resolution. What I think is not okay is to question the Jewish people's alliance or alignment with God, or to question their theological motivations, or to assume that they're working for a fallen power or something of that sort. We don't know that. Scripture doesn't indicate it either. Scripture indicates that when the fullness of the Gentiles comes into the church, God will begin working with Israel again. And we don't know if the fullness of the Gentiles has come into the church. We don't have specific numbers. It doesn't say, well, if you get 30% or 15%, it just doesn't offer that. It's something that we really don't know whether the fullness of the church has come in. But I would encourage my fellow Christians to, number one, study up on the Scriptures, study up on Second Temple literature, study up on the Genesis 6 worldview, study up on some of these Jewish concepts and ideas. And I think you'll find within them, it deepens your understanding of the nature of reality, the nature of God, the nature of what's playing out before us. Like I say, the Scriptures don't indicate that this will look pretty, that it will be easy, and that we will understand all of this first crack. But I think our posture towards the Jewish people has to be one of love and fellowship, not one of hatred.